This SkyJacker Silver 9000 dual steering stabilizer kit is for those of you that have a 2018 and up JL that are looking for a dual steering stabilizer setup for the front of your Wrangler. This is going to be a nice easy 1 out of 3 wrenches for the installation, just bolts right onto the Jeep, and we're going to show you how to get that done in just a second. So when you're shopping for a steering stabilizer, it's really important to know what it does and what it doesn't do. So a steering stabilizer, or more accurately a steering dampener, is really there so that when you hit a hole or a bump in the road, especially at speed, that shock that the tire feels that would otherwise be transferred up this drag link into the steering wheel, and you would feel it as the driver, is dampened down a little bit. That's really what it's all about. If you have a wobble, if you have bump steer, if you have any sort of looseness in your steering all the way up and to including death wobble, a steering stabilizer is not going to help your problem. If you have any of those issues, they are diagnosable, they are fixable, but a steering stabilizer is not your solution. Of course, if you have a bent, broken, or leaking steering stabilizer and you threw a new one on your Jeep that also had a wobble, it might make it feel a little bit better for a little while, but all you're going to do is buy yourself a little bit of time before your new steering stabilizer blows out and you still have the same suspension issue. So all of that is to say, if you have a properly well set up, nice and tight suspension and steering system underneath your Jeep, like you should, a steering stabilizer or steering dampener is going to be a luxury and not a necessity item. So, if you are shopping for a new steering stabilizer, it should be because yours is bent, broken, or otherwise leaking, or if you want something that is going to relocate your steering stabilizer, and that is the main reason that I would recommend a kit like this one. Normally your steering stabilizer hangs down between this bracket here and this one here, and it does occupy the space just below your tie rod, which is something that can get banged up on the trail. A kit like this is of course going to swing the stabilizer, both of them in this case, above the tie rod, which is going to offer them a little bit more protection. Now going from 1 to 2, it's going to give you a little bit more of that damping that we just talked about, but it's certainly not going to be a necessity. It's not going to be something that you have to add just because you put bigger tires on your Jeep or just because you put a lift kit on your Jeep. But again, if you are looking at stabilizers, I would recommend taking a look at ones that have a hydraulic shock like these ones have. Some of the other ones on the market actually use a nitrogen charged shock, and that's not something I would want to see for a steering stabilizer. With a nitrogen charged shock, the shock is constantly trying to open up and go to full extended, which can mean that you're actually constantly fighting the steering wheel a little bit as the shock is trying to push against your steering. That's just a way to really quickly wear out a lot of steering components and really just make it uncomfortable while you're driving. So a hydraulic shock is the way to go, and pretty much all of these shocks are going to be the same. It's going to be a 50-50 valved hydraulic shock, which means that any pressure that comes from this side is going to be resisted in the same way that any pressure is coming from this side. It's a pretty simple setup, really. So this kit's going to come with 2 of them. It's going to come with the bracket that clamps onto your axle, and also the 2 brackets that are going to clamp onto your tie rod. So again, everything you need to get this installed on your Jeep is going to be included, which is a nice feature. You don't want to purchase a kit and then have to go out and purchase additional hardware to make everything work. Now, this kit is going to come in at right around $150, where if you were just getting a replacement steering stabilizer, even an OEM style one, for a bent, broken, or leaking steering stabilizer, you could get away for about $50 or even less sometimes. So this is going to be significantly more expensive than that. That being said, you are getting 2 steering stabilizers and you're getting all of the bracketry. So if you are looking for a dual steering stabilizer setup, you want to be running 2 stabilizers on your Jeep, and you want a kit that's going to move the stabilizers above the tie rod, then this kit is going to be available to you as an option. So like I said before, easy 1 out of 3 wrenches for the install. Let's show you how to do it. So for this installation, we used a 14, 18, and 19 millimeter deep well socket driven by our 3/8 electric impact. We also used a 13 and 14 millimeter ratcheting wrench. We needed an adjustable wrench and a pair of channel locks, as well as a mallet, and we also used a measuring tape. So the first step in our installation is, of course, the uninstallation of our factory steering stabilizer. We're going to be adding 2 steering stabilizers to the Jeep. We certainly don't need 3, so we're going to go ahead and unbolt our factory one, and this is going to unbolt pretty easily, just 2 bolts to get it removed from the Jeep with an 18 millimeter deep well socket. Now we're removing the stabilizer from the bracket here. If you wanted to, you could remove these 2 bolts here to take the entire bracket off the tie rod. We're going to leave ours in place. Once you remove that bolt, you can take the steering stabilizer completely out of the Jeep. Now, just like with the other bracket, you could remove the 3 bolts and take this bracket off the axle. We're gonna leave ours in place, but if you wanted to, you could remove yours. Now we can jump into our installation, and the first step of that is going to be doing a little bit of assembly on the table here. So we have these studs, and these are what your new steering stabilizers are going to use to attach onto the main bracket here. So these studs need to get installed in the front of the main bracket, just like this. So we'll install those first, and then we're also going to install the bushings into our stabilizers themselves. So as you can see, there's not going to be any sort of hex head on the other end of this stud that you can hold while you're tightening this nut down. So it's recommended in the installation instructions that you use a large pair of pliers so that we can grab the outside of this and keep it from spinning. So we'll go ahead and attach both of our studs onto our main bracket now. Now that those studs are tightened down, we also put the washer and nut hardware on the other end of them just so we don't misplace anything. Of course, that's going to come back off when we actually put the stabilizers onto the studs. Now we can set our main bracket aside and grab our stabilizers themselves, along with the rubber bushings that need to be pressed into the eyelets. So there are a variety of different ways to do this. You can use a bench vise, you can use a C-clamp, you can use just a hammer like we're gonna try doing and popping them in. These are fairly pliable, and I think if we apply a little bit of lubrication to them, a swift knock with a hammer will pop them into place. So we're gonna give that a go, see what happens. These actually even pressed in easier than I thought they would. With a little bit of lubrication on them, you could just press them in by hand. Now we can jump back underneath the Jeep and get our main bracket installed on our differential. So where that's going to go is between our factory steering stabilizer bracket and the center section of the differential itself, right on this part of the axle, and it's going to get attached with a couple of these larger U-bolts and some of the nuts that come in the kit. So we'll get that bolted up. Now that we're under the Jeep, we'll get the main bracket bolted up, and it goes between our factory steering stabilizer bracket and the center section of our differential right here on the axle. So we'll get one of our U-bolts set over top of the axle tube. And you want the studs of the bracket to be on top of the tie rod. If you try and bolt this on the bottom of the tie rod, everything's not going to line up for you later. So make sure that's on top. We'll get the U-bolt put through our bracket, and we'll get just one of the nuts started on there. Then we can get the rest of the hardware on and the second U-bolt installed as well. So now we can just lift our bracket up so it is level, and we'll tighten our nuts down on the U-bolts. Now it's time to get our stabilizers attached onto our main bracket here. So this is the hardware that we had put on here, just hand tight to keep everything organized a moment ago. We're going to go ahead and remove that. Then we can get our stabilizer pressed over the stud here. And the other one. Once they're in place, we can set this decorative SkyJacker plate over top of those. This is an optional step. You could certainly leave this out if you wanted to. And then we'll go back with our flat washers, lock washers, and nuts to get everything bolted on. Once you have all the hardware started by hand, you can go back and tighten it up. The next bit of the install is to get these brackets installed onto the tie rod and onto your steering stabilizer. And what I'm actually going to do is get this firmly bolted onto the steering stabilizer, get the U-bolts that hold it onto the tie rod loosely set into place. Then we're going to adjust our steering stabilizer for length before we tighten the U-bolts down. Now, there are a variety of different ways to do this. That's just the order that I'm choosing to do this in. And the important part about getting the steering stabilizer adjusted or pulled out to the right length before we tighten down those U-bolts is that you want the stabilizer to be pretty much halfway through its travel when the steering is straight. So we park this with the tires straight. If we set the clamps on the tie rod so that the stabilizer is halfway through its travel, when we make a full lock to the right and a full lock to the left, neither one of the stabilizers is going to be either fully extended or fully compressed. So we'll go through that process on this side, and then we're going to repeat the same thing on the other side, and that'll just be about it for the install. So we'll put our washer that goes on the one side of our bushing over top of the stud on our stabilizer. And we'll put the bushing on there. Next we have our bracket. We have the other half of the bushing, the other half of the washer, and finally the nut. We'll tighten this up in just a second. What we're going to be using to tighten this is a wrench, and then we can also put a small wrench or an open-end wrench on the end here. There's a flat spot to keep that piston from completely turning inside of the stabilizer. Now we'll get our nut tightened down. We're going to use a 14mm ratcheting wrench over top of the nut. And then we'll use an open-ended wrench on the end here to keep the stud from spinning. Once we have the bushings compressed, and you can see plenty of threads on the outside of our piston here, that should be plenty tight. Now we'll move to attaching the U-bolts that attach the bracket onto the tie rod. At this point, we're going to set the steering stabilizer so it's midway through its stroke. That way, when we bolt the bracket down to the tie rod, we know it's in the right location. So what we're looking for is to pull this out about 3.5 inches. So we'll take a measurement here, and then we'll add 3.5 to that. It's about 1.5 inches now. So we'll go out to 5 inches. Right there, that'll do it. Then we'll grab our U-bolts and bolt our bracket down right there. Now we can tighten down these nuts. Now we'll repeat the process over here on the other side with our washers, our bushing, our bracket, the other half of the bushing, other washer, and the nut, and then we'll get everything tightened down before we take our measurement. Again, we'll take our measurement here. Start at right around 1.5 inches, and we want to go out to 5 inches here. Right about there. So we're pretty much right at the end of our tie rod here. And we'll grab our U-bolts and nuts and get that attached. So once that's tightened down, you're pretty much finished up with the installation. The last thing you're going to want to do is turn the wheels all the way lock to lock to make sure that you're not bottoming out either of your stabilizers. Of course, if you did your measuring correctly, you shouldn't have any sort of problem at all. So if you are looking for a dual steering stabilizer setup that's also going to move the stabilizers above the tie rod for a little bit of additional clearance off-road, I would recommend taking a look at this option from SkyJacker, and you can find it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.